sculptural in the traditional sense of the word, I don't think particularly interests him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I get the feeling that if he's got a kind of very particular formal interest that goes beyond the image, it's really more to do with spatial architectonics than it is to do with sculpture. I mean, I think that's, and I sort of feel now that when I wrote that chapter, I was writing it at a time when I was trying to, at a time when the traditional notion of sculpture was so out of the picture that if you wanted to make a case for sculpture, you had to choose something different. So, but now there's, heaven knows, a host of stuff that's now, even you might even say that some of it is really quite traditionally figurative in a way, and it's one of those modernist taboos that's been broken, that you cannot do the figure as people thought you used to be able to do. Whether it's for better or worse, I really don't know. And I thought in relation, in your questions about postmodernism, I mean, I think the trouble is it's such a loose term, postmodernism. And I think there is what I would call the historical postmodernism, which really got going in the late 70s and climaxed in the 80s, and probably was most consistently visible in architecture, with the breakdown of the minimal, the functionalist modernist aesthetic. However, it's a sort of a floating term. I mean, I've had I was involved in a panel just recently, and we were discussing this, and I sort of think that maybe I would say in a funny sort of way that Nauman could be called post-minimalist. He might even be seen as sort of postmodern. But I think unlike a lot of the sort of really postmodern in the larger sense work, I think form matters to him. And I think there's always a formal nexus, which is absolutely central to his aesthetic. And that formal nexus is often sort of imposed in a somewhat minimalist way, that it's very pared down, walking up and down the corridor, going round and round the four sides of a square. But he is interested in that that sort of formal, there's a very, very clearly defined, simple formal structure which permeates the logic of the work. And in that sense, I would say that, he is one of those, he's not a traditional high modernist, but he's somebody who is one of these people who, of that generation, like Richard Serra, who are still very committed to working within the constraints of a sort of self-declared formal vocabulary. So that's, there is, but he is he is of his time in the sense that he does introduce time as a literal element as well as just an implied element. He works across many different media, and it's not kind of, he doesn't feel circumscribed to stick. He's not medium. He's not a Greenbergian medium purist in any sense of the word.
Right.
But he is, he's a very committed formalist in an interesting way. So in that sense, he's sort of, he's been so, you could almost say it's almost as if things like Joseph Olber's, homage to a square still sits in the background of his artistic imaginary as something that he was brought up on, even if he doesn't hold to it anymore. I think he's part of that.
I was interested in your book how you said his minimalist work at, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're a bit, it's funny, you're a bit echoey. I don't know why.
Oh, let's see. I was recording the audio on my phone too, just in case as a backup. So does that help anymore, or?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay. But in your book where you were saying that you were less interested in, his works at the University of California at Davis were minimalist in nature, but you seemed least impressed with those. And I was just interested in whether it's correct to say that the aims of minimalism are basically kind of inform his work.
Oh, yeah, I mean, in that sense, I would say he's sort of, chronologically it doesn't work, but he's kind of a minimalist who's also post-minimalist. That he has no worries about introducing representational elements into his work. The human body is there, the figure is there, but I think he is interested in that working with a very sort of minimalized, pared down procedure. And in that sense, there's a kind of minimalist aesthetic that pervades his work. But it's and I think that I was sort of thinking about it. I mean, if you think of, I think music is an area where you really get a very firm grip on what minimalism might be. And I think where they're different from Nauman is that people like Steve Reif repeat the same thing, but the point of it is that there's very slight variations in the repetitions. And what you're then attuned to is an amazing refinement, whereby you see in each repetition something different, which helps to make the repetition more mesmerizing in a way. Nauman is straight repetition, except I think that perhaps there's elements of the Contrapposto, the most recent Contrapposto, that moves away from that. That it's, you feel that it is, it's a repetitive movement, but you see an old man struggling with his somewhat less than obedient body.
Right.
And coming out with, whereas in his early work, what was astounding, walking around a square in an exaggerated manner, is how he sustained it so that everything almost looked exactly the same. It was very, very disciplined. The Contrapposto isn't disciplined in quite the same sort of rigorous way. So it's got a slightly more fluid temporality, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think of in my writing, in the dissertation, I actually referenced some of your book, and I referenced some of Deleuze's terms about naked and naked repetition. So one being repetition being more almost, mechanical and straight, exact repetition versus clothed repetition, where they're more, I guess, more organic and there's more room for variety or differences. So I understand what you mean about Reich and there being kind of slight variations that refine the difference. I was interested also in your use of the term spatial architectonics, and what really drew me to, am I still echoing, or can you hear me okay, Professor? Am I still echoing, or can you hear me okay?
Fine, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay. What drew me to the PhD was trying to describe or explain the feeling in that space, like for instance, in Anthro, Socio, and you call it a charged space, and I'm very interested in that, what I termed that feeling of liminality, but how the way that I was understanding minimalist sculpture, the change in minimalist sculpture was that it's no longer, and even in that talk I watched of you in Oregon, is it's no longer about looking at, let's say, a painting on a wall, but once Donald Judd or any of the minimalists, Carl Andre, put that type of, let's say, a box on the floor of the gallery, suddenly the space is charged differently. I mean, you already say automatically that viewing any sculpture is going to be different than viewing a painting, because it involves the bodily negotiation of walking around it, looking at it from different angles, and that automatically involves temporality as well. Of watching during the interview of you in Oregon, I think the moderator was saying, well, temporality in sculpture, and then, but I mean, it involves time just in the mode of viewing. But I'm very interested in it being a charged space that targets the body versus the intellect, maybe. I'm not sure if that relates to what you meant by spatial architectonics, or if that's just the building of the space. But
well, I think there's two. I mean, I think that charged space is important. I mean, that's Anthro Socio through and through, and you get different degrees of intensity as you move around. And I think that's where there is this other element to Nauman, which is very important. And that is, I would call it the psychoanalytic element. The repetition compulsion is crucial to his work. And I think this sense of being excluded, being drawn in and yet excluded is another. He's playing psychological games with you. And I also think that the repetitions, Anthro Socio is like that, and the cloud piece, is that you're not just trapped within a motif, you're psychically trapped. There is no way out of this.
Right.
And the other one I remember very vividly was that one, it's sort of eternal peace talks, which he did at the time when Clinton was negotiating peace all over the place. And there's all these heads saying, I am speaking to you, and we are speaking to them, and we are speaking to him, and he is speaking to us, and all these voices going on, and you just realize there's no way out of this damn game.
Right.
This is what negotiation is like. You don't get anywhere. I mean, you're sort of changing all the time, but you don't get. But that's because it has this psychological dimension to it, or it's really just like the room with its
soul left
out,
right.
Room that does not care,
Or even the get out of my mind, get out of this room, which is just only the audio,
I know.
Nothing else. It has to make viewers want to flee the space.
It does.
In another section you mentioned, I was very interested in your mention of psychic splitting or self-displacement. It's very kind of subtle, the idea, and I even think that it's kind of referenced in Anthro Socio in terms of the disembodied head, but the idea that, I think it's the idea that the viewer would somehow be kind of split from, the mind body is kind of split, and since it's an assault on the body, it's kind of separating oneself from oneself, if that's a good way to put it.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I suppose there's the split. The split begins in Anthro Socio, where you are being addressed and refused at exactly the same time. The way the chants come out at you, you're being repelled, but it's being addressed. It's rather like there's this big head trying to get something over to you, but at the same time, they're not focused on you. They're displacing you from the space in front of them, and that does. And if you stand in towards the middle of the piece, if you move out a little bit, you really feel assailed.
Oh, okay, yeah. Definitely.
And I suppose also there's the way that having the smaller heads upside down, that kind of inverts and kind of distances or subverts the standard. If you think with standard talking heads, you're made, particularly TV ones, you're given the illusion that the person is talking to you.
Right.
And Nauman sort of says, well, let's try something where that is refused.
Sure.
That invitation is given but immediately stamped upon and taken away. And I think that that's where the one where there's the two heads side by side, where they go this crescendo of different reactions.
Good boy, bad boy, or
Yeah, good boy, bad boy, yeah. And that sort of that does seem to be a standard sort of address. But when it goes nowhere, again you feel this is not being put on for you. This is refusing your participation and presence.
Sure.
These people are just completely obsessed with their own, their own immediate state of mind as they go through these different alternatives. So
I was really surprised by the line that you wrote in the Sculptural Imagination, where you said that, in the history of modernist art, the focus on the act of beholding was, absent from modernist theory. It's just how much modernism or modernist art doesn't take into account the beholder, whereas, which you think is pretty shocking in a way, just that kind of refusal or ignoring of the beholder, versus in postmodern sculpture, then, for instance, in Nauman, incorporating the viewer more.
Well, I think I think that statement was very much of its moment. And I think it was sort of taking modernism in the sense of the strictly autonomous work of art. That idea that it doesn't, and there were a lot of artists who were saying, I don't make it for an audience, I make it because it has its own internal logic, which I've got to follow. There's a difficulty, of course, where the interaction with the viewer becomes part of the formal conception of the work. And I think that's, again, somebody like Richard Serra is into that. I think Carl Andre is like that. He's very aware of the whole business about the invitation to walk on something that you're loath to walk on is part of that. But that becomes internal to the artwork. So it's not sort of reception theory type.
It's part of the form.
It's a formal. Yeah. So it's totally unlike the inclusive spectacle kind of experience that a lot of artists are going in for nowadays. But I think modernism did take this idea that obviously, yes, the viewer is taken into account, and there's a lot of very interesting forms of modernist art, that negotiate the relationship between the viewer and the object quite interestingly. As Krauss has shown in the case of Brancusi's sculpture, that is but I think that there's an ostensible ideology that you talk about the work in and of itself, rather than, I suppose, a kind of imagist, high modernist theory of the work of art. And it's interesting if you think of the way somebody like Barnett Newman works, which is very viewer position is actually quite important. But in the end, he wants the work of art to tell entirely in its own terms. He doesn't want your baggage that you bring as a viewer to interfere with the work. You get inside his idea.
Right. Good point. Well, Professor, I wanted to ask, I highlighted some of my assertions regarding, it's interesting that Nauman hasn't really been read in terms of Roland Barthes, and I was, very influenced by his essay, The Third Meaning, and how he takes a film still out of context in it. it leads to this third obtuse meaning.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
suddenly I'm thinking of clown torture in that regard. And so once I apply the third meaning to clown torture, I see it in part of the video where the clown is scooting on his haunches, and it's kind of an unexplainable action. And in my assertion, I also linked the punctum, which in Barthes' terms is some aspect of a photograph that is a particularly odd detail. But looking at Naumann's videos over and over, I came to the theory that since the action is so brief and then set on repeat, that it does function like a film still, in that Barthes specifically said the third meaning does not apply to film or the moving image, because when the viewer's watching a film for 2 hours, we don't have time to look at a single frame. But I'm arguing that the looping mechanism allows that extended viewing, and it functions like a film still. So I was wondering if, and then in terms of so it becomes, I'm suggesting that it expands Barthian semiotics in terms of being a moving third meaning, and also the punctum is a moving punctum. But I'm also interested in how the viewer ends up taking on the role of inhabiting the third meaning and inhabiting that punctum in that space. So I'm just curious, I thought I'd run that by you and see what you thought about Barthes and Nauman.
Well, I think there is something I think your point, I probably wouldn't quite see it in those exact terms, but then we all have our own ways of approaching things. I think the thing is that I suppose with the Nauman is that it isn't still. That's the problem. It has no beginning and no end, and therefore it doesn't have that crystallizing effect of the film still. And I think that when one looks at the photographs of Naumann's work, I think it's hard to say that something new is revealed about them as a result. Holding one piece of it, all you use those photographs for is to sort of vaguely remind yourself of the configuration and what went on, and you imagine the movements yourself. But I think it might, in a sense, if you thought about it, it might be worth pushing it in a sense to say, well, whereas the third meaning applies to film, there's a temptation to try to apply it to Nauman, but maybe it's because Nauman isn't film. That it doesn't quite work. The fact that it doesn't quite work is that there isn't a still that you could pull out of the Nauman. And the whole point about the third meaning is that it's some aspect that you don't normally see. Now, what could there be in the Nauman that's some aspect that you're not normally aware of? And I think the trouble is with the Nauman, you're so trapped in this kind of repetitive, ongoing process that you can't pull something out of it that is characteristic. And I think that's also, the case with the whole point about the punctum is that you're looking at a photograph and you take in the conventional meaning, but despite that, there's some peculiar aspect of the photograph that completely intrigues you. You see the essence of it lying in that, even though it has nothing to do with the larger significance of the whole image you're presented with. It's some peculiarity which gives a twist to your response. Is there something like that in Nauman? Can you pull out some aspect of it that gives a twist to your response to the work? I think it'd be interesting to think about, but there again, it might be interesting to think about it by saying, well, in fact, though there is a photographic element to Nauman. He's not using photography in the way that Barthes sees photography as this frozen moment. That's why it's death-like. It's this frozen moment that presents something that's gone. And the Nauman, it neither comes nor goes. It's there and not there, but it's an ongoing process. It's that that effect of short-circuiting. So I think there's a sort of maybe something quite interesting to think about in terms of how Nauman seems to invite one to think in terms of conventional media categories, but he's devised a kind of work that doesn't quite fit any of them. It's not to say that it's stupendously original or something, but it is something weird, that it doesn't quite fit any of these categories. And that, of course, might be the punctum. It's the fact that it doesn't, trying to make sense of it. And there's something that you can't make sense of, which doesn't allow you with how you make sense of a film or an image or a sculpture in the traditional sense of the word. And then what is it that's kind of mesmerizing you in this work?
Almost like an absent punctum if you can't make sense of it.
And it's something, I would say it's its sheer triviality, which is the appeal. There's something about it. It just is meaningless, and yet it is kind of significant. It's such a stupid idea of wandering up and down a corridor.
Right.
And it has that. So there may be something that may be the punctum of the Nauman.
It's interesting that in the second half of Camera Lucida, he has a second punctum that he brings up, which is not just that point of a photograph, but he doesn't use the term punctum of death, but I've seen that in Michael Fried's article on the punctum. But his idea was that looking at a photograph, and he said it applies more to historical photographs where we know for sure that the person, is no longer, and he even used that one photograph of the guy about to be executed, but not only the idea that the person is not around anymore, but the idea that, meaning not living, but the idea that that person caught in that time at that moment, let's say a young boy at 5 years old, we know that he is never what he was on that day. So the idea that every photograph, really, whether or not the person is dead or not, is suffused with this future kind of imminence of not being there. And in applying that to Anthro Socio, in terms of the disembodied heads, but also I was wondering if you thought maybe the idea that they're both, since the performer is alive, Rind is still alive, whether they kind of function as both living and dead entities in terms of applying the punctum of death to Anthro Socio.
I think it might be, I would say where it's stronger is actually it's evident in the way that if you think of the two versions of Contrapposto, and that the Nauman is looking back to something that is no more, this youthful body driving up and down, and he amplifies the sensation of that by showing a body which is, it's not deathly, but it's an aged body by comparison with youthful body, which won't be around for much longer. There is a sort of sense of what is this earlier representation of self, and that would tie in with your point of history, because this earlier work is part of his history, and it's already part of the history of art in a sense, it's back in the past. But it's his body back then that is no longer existent. He's saying death is imminent in life.
It kind of relates to one point that I wanted to make about trauma, in terms of reading Hal Foster on minimalism in The Return of the Real. He brings up the idea that in Warhol's, let's say, Death and Disaster series, that the repeated imagery dilutes the sense of trauma. And whereas I was applying it to Nauman and saying his repetition can dilute our sense of meaning, let's say, but I would say it intensifies the trauma on the other hand. I was wondering if you see any comparison between Nauman's use of repetition and Warhol, or comparison or contrast.
Well, I think you have a good point there. And I think in a way it spills back into Warhol, because at one level you can say the repeated images deflect, they desensitize the trauma. I think it comes back almost with a higher charge because of the sheer triviality of seeing those repetitions, and then you're inured to it, but then suddenly it breaks down, like the people crushed under a car. You can't go on looking at that without it getting at you in some way. And I think there is a slight similarity there, that there is a use of repetition, which formerly would seem to say, oh, we just become inured to it. But then there's something quite frightening about getting to the stage where what is so traumatic becomes every day, becomes kind of flattened out, becomes indifferent, becomes a banality. But then you think, shit, this banality is traumatic, If you just accept lots and lots of atomic bomb bursts in different colors and start thinking, or lots of electric chairs, you think, gosh, these are all beautiful. But the sheer banality of thinking of that then becomes very troubling.
Sure.
And you're brought back to the trauma. It's a different kind. It's probably a slightly more self-conscious sense of trauma. It's not just the immediate response. I suppose with the Nauman, it's sort of slightly the other way around. You start with the Warhol, you think of the violent image, and then it's repeated, and then it's diffused and banalized by virtue of repetition, and then comes back at you. I think that Nauman gives you the banality of repetition up front, and then you think, what the hell? Something else is going on that's deeply troubling. And therein is the sort of trauma.
Definitely. And I was interested also in, you used the word an immediate present in terms of minimalist sculpture. Yeah. The idea that being, I guess, more present in the moment, and I was also interested in your use of the term of the chanting in Anthro Socio, kind of producing almost like a meditative state in a way, this altered kind of mental state.
Yes, well, I think there is a way. I mean, everybody talks about sculpture, figurative sculpture, as having an immediate presence, but most sculptures don't have that effect on one. They can begin to have that effect on one if you get obsessed with them, and you start looking at them really hard. I think that Nauman, sort of by giving you just this big face that's barking at you, gives you the immediate presence head on. You can't avoid it, And then, as you say, you get displaced from it because you don't stick at that head on confrontation with the presence of his head. It becomes abstracted by virtue of the repetition. And therefore you move away from it. But it doesn't do it in sculptural terms. It's really it's more like a large portrait face that you says has a presence. But if it starts speaking at you, then it has a more immediate kind of literal presence.
Right.
And that's what Nauman gives you there.
So it's interesting that, I mean, you think of, just to return to Anthro Socio, whether or not there's even, you mentioned it in your book that we are still in the presence of sculpture. He's still has created a sculpture, but in the Anthro Socio, we really have no object, right, at all, besides those little recorders or the monitors, but it becomes just the image on the wall, and it's almost as if the image is gazing at the viewer, so the space becomes, and then the fact that the viewer is kind of like frozen in that temporality, especially by the sound. It's almost as if the viewer I mean, would you say that that's correct in saying that the image, the Lind or the Rind character is kind of viewing the audience? Do you think you would say
He's
that?
got doing the audience. Well, I think the trouble is that he adopts the pose of a barker at the audience, that he shows no sensitivity to the audience. You know, he's adopted the rhetoric of address, um, but it's not. It has no audience, or it has the audience of people in the gallery. I mean, when I said that Anthro Socio was sculptural, I think what I was getting at more that there is sculpture is the art that picks up the leftovers from the image on the wall, as it were, or the flat image. And those leftovers are a real thing in real space. And the other leftover is the kinesthetic experience of space, which is probably most in its purest form exhibited in architecture. And I think that Nauman sometimes does give you pieces that sort of excerpt a kind of architectural experience or a feeling of architectonic space, but gives it to you in an intensity and a purity that no architect would, because an architect is doing other jobs. They're not interested in the phenomenology of space as a completely self-sufficient goal. So that, in that sense, it's sculptural. But I think you're right that there is it's non-sculptural in the sense that these are not tangible images. These are not tangible things. I think some painted, if you think of a portrait by Lucian Freud, I mean, I think there's a sort of tangibility to it. And Anthro Socio, it's not tangible, it's odd because it's not tangible, but it's not dematerialized. It certainly has a material substance, but it's not a three-dimensional sort of tangible thing. I mean, if it was actually a head that big, a big wax head barking at you, it would be stupidly discomforting. It would be.
Wow.
It's like Osler, who does those little moving faces, and once they're sort of once they're sort of thrust out into three dimensions, it becomes a bit corny. He makes them all quite small. The faces are all quite small, then it works. But can you imagine that huge face shouting at you?
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around that. That would be interesting.
It wouldn't. It wouldn't be disturbing so much as just bothersome. It would invade you. It would invade you too much. And as you were saying, I think that was a point that I made as well. I think in passing, is that the whole thing about something like Anthro Socio is it's quite a demanding experience. But what it is also what you feel reflecting on it in recollecting it in tranquility, in a sense, that you've got an experience and you're trying to think about its significance. And so there is it seems to be anti-contemplative because it's so immediate and repetitive. But because it's so repetitive, you are invited to take another stand to move out from it and think about what the significance and parameters of your experience are.
Well, plus if it's anti-contemplative, but also the sound, and like you even said, there's a kind of it evokes a feeling of wanting to repeat the mantra, right? So then there's a kind of disjunction between being anti-contemplative, but also it kind of luring the viewer into contemplation in a way via the mesmerizing sound, and those kind of are butt heads in a way.
Yeah, I think he enjoys the idea of the discomfort creates in you.
Right. Well, there's the anecdote of him of when it was shown, the exhibit of someone coming in and finding Nauman, after hours lying on the floor listening to Anthro with his eyes closed, just I don't know why, but that feeling, right? Or where it takes him, or
yeah. No, I think that is sort of it is kind of interesting, yeah, and it's that sort of heightened intensity of it, which makes it different from some of his more calm, more obviously meditative pieces. In a sense, I don't think many of his early works are meditative, but some of his later works are. That one, the one he did on his ranch for driving the horse round and round in circles, you know, that's all. The scene of the studio recorded where you just see virtually nothing going on.
Right, yeah.
But it's no, he's a kind of it's intriguing. Well, I must say this has been really interesting talking to you, and it sort of made me think about Nauman again. I hadn't really, you know, it's funny when you write something, it's all in the past. You know, you need a spur, and I'm glad to have it. And I will be able to put this into effect when I go to see the show in Venice to see what sense I make of it.
Great. Yeah, I'm also going to attend the show in Milan. I think maybe in December or